This talk is based on some recent research I did, a new project, and most of what I'm presenting will be some ethnographic observations. It concerns, though, an issue that came up particularly in the earlier panel about the boundaries and identity of Europe, though I approach that question through a musical practice, which is more than just musical. In the spring of 1915, the Spanish composer Manuel de Falla, still a young man, made his first visit to Granada, together with his then collaborator, the dramatist Maria Martínez Sierra. The spell of the Alhambra had already fallen over Falla some years before when, while living in Paris, he had come across the book Granada, Guía Emocional by Gregorio Martínez Sierra, Maria's husband. Much as Washington Irving before him, Falla was inspired by the images and stories of the Moorish fortress and had begun to explore Andalusian themes in his compositions. Elements drawn from Andalusia folk traditions, and especially flamenco, also found increasing expression within his musical vocabulary, most strikingly in El Amor Brujo, The Three-Cornered Hat, and Fantasia Bética. Falla's appropriation of Andalusian folk music had garnered an ambivalent response from Spanish critics, some applauding the quintessentially Spanish character of his work, others deriding it for presenting a caricature of Spain and Spanishness, one based in the same romanticized stereotypes that dominated popular images of the country abroad. As they arrived at the Alhambra, Martínez Sierra requested that Falla close his eyes and then led him by the hand into the Palacio de Comares, the Hall of Ambassadors, the site where Boabdil, the last of the Moorish kings, signed over his realm to the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. In her memories, she describes the moment. He opened his eyes. I won't forget the ah that came out of his mouth. It was almost a cry, simple admiration, the pleasure of having guessed through the pages of a book an enchantment previously unknown. I think that moment of total happiness, his cry left no room for doubt, was one of those ecstasies that compensated for the torment of his existence. The emotion wouldn't let him feel anything else. We now recognize Falla's passionate response to Moorish style and his attraction to Andalusia's folk traditions as element of a romantic sensibility, one integral to the development of Spanish nationalism. In Spain, the nationalist project of recovering and promoting those cultural traditions expressive of the Spanish soul has often been accompanied by a similar ambivalence to that provoked by Falla's work. This ambivalence has a complicated genealogy, one key part of which concerns Spain's peripheral position in relation to the civilizational space of Europe, its function as Europe's internal orient within that project. While I discuss elsewhere some of the ways Spain's marginal status within Europe mediated its appropriation of its Moorish past, here it will suffice to note that insomuch as the construction of Spain's pure and eternal Catholic soul within a long-standing tradition of Spanish historical reflection has necessitated a systematic amnesia in regard to the 800 years of Moorish rule, then attempts to find a Spanish culture within traditions displaying their, quote, Oriental roots has often been met with anxiety or derision. My exploration of certain musical currents in contemporary Spain is one piece of a broader inquiry into how Spain's multiple and long-standing entwinements with the Middle East fracture and disrupt current attempts to consolidate European identity around a shared Christian heritage, one prophylactically articulated against a Muslim and Middle Eastern other. To be clear, I'm not interested here in a historical defense of the claim that Spain's musical traditions are genealogically linked to Middle Eastern poetic and musical forms, a claim that in rough outlines few would dispute today, though the relevance and political status of the claim remain fraught issues. Rather, I want to explore the way practices and sensibilities cultivated and promoted by contemporary musicians articulate a distinct geographical, temporal, and epistemological space, one enabled by, but not reducible to, the political and economic forces that regulate heritage and tradition within global culture. This space I want to propose might be usefully titled, borrowing a phrase from Ghilani Jar, A Future of al-Andaluz. I began with Manuel de Falla's cry, ah, upon opening his eyes, as icon of an experience that defies expression within the modernist ideological frames that mediate the power of historical artifacts, particularly the discourses of primitivism, romanticism, and folklorization of his and our time. In this sense, my interest here extends beyond music proper to its relations with the palimpsestic territory of Andalusia. The Teteria Tetuan, or the Tetuan Tea House, is located just a few blocks from Plaza Nueva, the touristic heart of Granada, with the medieval Moorish quarter of Albaicin rising on one side and the Alhambra looming from the cliffs above on the other. The day I visited, the locale's Moroccan owners, Ridwan and Ahmed, had hired a photographer to come by and take some promotional pictures of the musical group they were forming, an ensemble specializing in what they called Maghrebi Andalusi music. The shop itself, as with all of the many other tourist-vying tea houses along the street, was laid out in full Oriental regalia. The turbaned man in the Casbah paintings, the low cloth-covered benches and cushioned chairs, the incense and water pipes, the ouds and inlaid platters set on the walls. Members of the group arrived, changing into the Eastern dress they had brought specially for the photo. For men, a white jalabia, tarbouche, and pointy Moroccan shoes. For the women, colorful jalabias, sandals, and no hats. The group was composed of 4 Spaniards, 2 women and 2 men, all but 1 converts to Islam, and 3 Moroccan men. As they prepared for the photograph, they chatted and joked with each other in a Spanish interspersed with many Arabic expressions. Javier plays the clarinet. He had converted to Islam some years ago, shortly after having begun his university studies. Prior to conversion, as he told me, he had been a committed Catholic and was even a member of the Catholic Nationalist Association, Opus Dei. He narrates his decision to convert this way. I was always very religious and therefore curious to learn about other religions. During my first year at the university, I took classes in Islamic studies. Islam's unified and comprehensive theology resonated with my own rationalist inclinations. I'm quoting him. After having studied it for a semester, I made the decision to convert. Javier decided to pursue a major in Arabic studies at the University of Granada, a decision that, among other things, led him to spend a year at a language school in Yemen. He also began on his own to learn as much as he could about Andalusia's musical traditions, reading literature on the topic in both Spanish and Arabic, finding ways to meet and play with some of Granada's leading Andalusi musicians, many from Morocco, traveling to Fez, Tangiers, and Tetuan to listen to music of Maghrebi musicians, both in concert settings and at zawiyas, the Sufi sites of ritual practice and learning, where Andalusi music is regularly performed. After a few years of study, he developed and taught a course at the university on Andalusi music. Beyond his current group, he has pioneered a number of initiatives to promote awareness of the music, including organizing a series of public workshops on it, and setting up a website that provides historical information on its medieval textual sources and contemporary Middle Eastern variants, a description of the genre's rules, scales, rhythms, and structure, a translation of key concepts and aesthetic vocabulary, and much more. In his engagements with the Andalusi tradition, Javier has at times found himself obliged to make obeisance to contemporary tastes and musical aptitudes of Spanish audiences. The work of creative reconstruction entailed in this act involves the balancing and combining of evaluative criteria from diverse traditions. Spanish audiences, for example, do not have the patience to sit through a performance lasting many hours, as Andalusi music traditionally entails, and it is still performed as it is still performed in Morocco. Rather than forcing his listeners to tough it out, Javier and his ensemble seek to gently retune the sensibilities of their listeners by interspersing the long segments that audiences find tiring with shorter pieces that incorporate elements from flamenco, the familiarity of the motifs providing a rest for the ears of audiences unaccustomed to the lengthy performances. His description of a recent project offers a fascinating example of the project of creative synthesis he has taken on. I quote, "In the most commercial repertory of Arabic music, there is a song that is played everywhere, because it has a melody pleasing to Western audiences, Lama Bada Yatathanna. It is an Oriental composition from an Egyptian or Syrian composer of the late 19th or early 20th century. I have to check, and not part of the Andalusian heritage. The rhythm, for example, is 10/4, called Semai, and of Turkish origin. But the poetry over which the melody was written is a muwashaha, considered to be Andalusian. though I don't know from which anthology it was taken. A little background on the poetry used in Andalusi music is useful here. The poetic form at the heart of the Andalusi repertoire is called the muwashaha. Originating in Andalusia around the 9th or 10th century, this strophic form was written in classical Arabic and is structured around two alternating rhyme patterns. However, the last few lines of the muwashaha, known as the kharja or departure, was written in a different lexical register, sometimes in colloquial Arabic, though also in ahaimado, that is, Hispano-Romance, a mixture of Romance and Arabic, written with Arabic script. The kharjas had remained a mystery until the middle decades of the 20th century, when the British scholar S.M. Stern and the Spanish Arabist Emilio Garcia Gomez were able to decipher the antique Spanish lying beneath the Arabic calligraphy. The recognition of the kharja as one of the foundational moments in the development of a European literary tradition provided a key opening to a reconsideration of Europe's relation to the Middle East. As the historian Carla Mallet has recently noted, this recognition culminated in the integration of an Arab past into a narrative of national origin and the identification of an Arab voice as the earliest expression of a modern European identity. Javier goes on to describe how, in responding to his friend's request for a Spanish version of an Andalusi song, he was led himself to the ahaimado kharjas. Anyway, I quote, "When our group was making a recording, our friends and families insisted that we also sing something in Spanish. So in a few of the songs we translated, more or less, some of the strophes and sang them in Spanish. But with the Lemabada, a song that had already been sung in Spanish, I thought I would try to find a kharja with the same meter in the published collections of kharjas by different authors." These public collections are the only existing evidence of this earlier medieval tradition. There are no indications on how they were played, but the poetic basis still exists in some medieval anthologies. I didn't have to look long, as one of the most cited kharjas in the scholarly literature fit the theme of the song perfectly. Because the kharjas fit so well with the meter and meaning of the Arabic poetry of the lemma, we inserted it into the song and recorded it that way. How do we situate Javier's interpretive and musical engagement with the classical kharja poetic form? The diagram of this practice is complex, including the forms of knowledge it draws upon, the geopolitical conditions that enable it, the linguistic and musical competencies it requires. Guided by a personal ethic around the historical authenticity of things Andalusian, Javier is quick to point out the non-Andalusian origin of some of lemma's components, and particularly the extent to which its popularity and circulation owe to its fit with the aesthetic sensibilities of Western listeners, shaped in part by the burgeoning world music industry. However, despite the song's, quote, compromised status, Javier willingly takes it up, an act impelled by affective ties to, quote, friends and family, as he tells us. His solution, however, is not to produce a modern translation of an ancient textual fragment, but to uncover an artifact capable of inhabiting and bridging two languages at once, the verse in ahaimado, thereby creating an aesthetic gesture built on a certain orientation affected between past and present. This gesture does not invent a history where none existed, but finds one nested in the social and aesthetic landscape at his disposal, one which he animates and communicates. This act of composition, it might be claimed, is modeled on the kharja itself. In Andalusi poetry, the muwashaha, spoken in classical Arabic, corresponds to the voice of the lover, while the kharja, spoken in the colloquial, and often a hybrid of Arabic, Hebrew, and Romance, expresses the response of the beloved. Like the kharja, Javier's response to the ties of relationship is to shift voice from Arabic, still a foreign tongue to his audience, to a hybrid form that his listeners can orient themselves within, if awkwardly. The ahaimado, which contains elements of Spanish, some recognizable by contemporary speakers. Let us note as well that the aesthetics of the kharja correspond to a particular sociological condition, as a gesture from the Arabic-speaking poet to the plurilingual context of his performance, a gesture repeated in Javier's recrafting of the lemma. In so doing, he neither panders to his audience's musical taste nor simply ignores them, but uses those tastes as a vehicle to teach his listeners a musical aesthetic tradition he greatly values. In what ways might we see this art, with its itineraries of travel, of linguistic and musical learning, as opening an event structure warranting the appellation "A Future of al-Andaluz"? Javier's engagement with the Andalusi musical tradition in many ways bears the imprint of its modern European context. Andalusia's heritage industry ensures an interested public, as does the marketing of so-called world music. The close economic relations between Spain and Morocco ensure access to Moroccan musicians and musical expertise, making it affordable for Javier to study under the guidance of Moroccan experts in the genre. Moreover, his ensemble's practice space is a teteria in Albaicin, owned by his Moroccan bandmates and kept afloat economically by the Orientalist desires of travelers and tourists. While his musical practice draws sustenance from such economic and political forces, they are not exhaustively determined by it. The aesthetic sensibilities he cultivates and teaches, the geography of knowledge he articulates, and I'm thinking both of the kind of study he's done in learning Arabic and to acquire the ability to read in medieval Arabic as well as the musical learning that necessitated lengthy periods in Morocco. The geography of knowledge he articulates, weaving together both sides of the Mediterranean in order to recover a lost musical form. His serious study of Arabic poetic forms, the patterns of friendship, association, and belonging enacted along the course of this endeavor. In all these ways, Javier's musical wanderings trace the cartography of an Islamic Europe, one whose historical opening is figured by the image of al-Andaluz. The fascination and romance with al-Andaluz promoted today by the heritage industry and through the cultural politics of the Andalusian state have also opened up new possibilities for remapping one's place within Europe, for organizing one's life within a different political and cultural geography than that promoted by the tourist industry or state managers of cultural identity. How might such a practice of learning, sociability, and performance reshape the way some dimensions of the past articulate with the present and future, offering for some a vision of a different Europe than that being consolidated around an anti-immigrant political platform? Let me carry this a little more forward. In the longer version of this paper, I also speak about the sort of forms of sociability that are both among converts and non-convert Spaniards and Moroccans that have been necessary to and a part of this form of musical learning. Ahmed, the co-owner of the teteria and the group's violinist, though also a master of the oud and banjo as well, came to Granada 25 years ago in order to study Spanish literature at the University of Granada. As with so many Arab visitors to and residents of Granada, he expresses his sense of ease and familiarity with the city through the oft-heard refrain, "It feels like home here, like Fez, or Damascus, or Algiers, or Ramallah, or even Cairo." He arrived already an accomplished musician, having studied at a conservatory in Morocco, though also having learned music through his participation in zawiyas. By his own account, it was not until he came to Granada, quote, Andalusi's music's home, that he became seriously interested in the genre. Ahmed has played with a number of the most renowned musicians of Andalusian musical styles in both Morocco and Spain, including some of the pioneering figures in the European early music movement, who, from the late 1960s, began to study and attempt to recreate medieval Andalusian music. Some of the Spanish musicians who carried this project of historical recreation forward, led by Eduardo and Gregorio Paniagua, Luis Delgado, and Begoña Olavide, had originally been inspired by listening to UNESCO recordings of Moroccan Andalusian music. This gave impetus to a series of collaborative efforts involving Spanish and North African musicians. Many of the Spanish musicians ended up spending long periods in Morocco, especially in Tetuan and Tangiers, learning to play medieval Andalusian music through the lens provided by contemporary North African Andalusian traditions. In Morocco, there was a continuous tradition of Andalusi music, a tradition that had evolved considerably since the medieval times, but in Morocco is understood as a continuously evolving tradition. This gave impetus to a series, the result of this exchange, as Dwight Reynolds has recently explored, is a unique fusion of the principles and aesthetics of the European early music movement on one hand, and a living oral tradition, that is the Moroccan tradition, on the other. That is, Spanish musicians, the only way they could recover this tradition was to go to Morocco and study the contemporary variant of it under the tutelage of Moroccan musicians. commenting on a more recent endeavor by these musicians to put to music the poetry of such Andalusian poets as Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn al-Khatib, Reynolds writes, "In all of these performances, the texts are authentically medieval, but the melodies are taken from modern Andalusian traditions from North Africa, and the aesthetic treatment is rooted in the ideas of the European early music movement, that is, in small ensembles rather than a large orchestra, and with the use of reconstructions of period instruments. A fascinating hybrid based upon three different sources and concepts of authenticity. In other words, a musical practice founded on historicist assumptions that secure the pastness of a past practice, that is, the early European music movement, becomes inflected by a tradition with distinct and quite different criteria of continuity and historical fidelity, the existing Moroccan traditions. The new amalgamation that is forged, of course, is made possible to some extent by the world music industry, as well as by the new political and economic linkages uniting Spain with North Africa, though neither of these conditions exhaustively determine the form it takes. Two of the leaders in the field of medieval Arabo-Andalusian musical traditions, Carlos Paniagua and Begoña Olavide, have in recent years set up a music school to teach the tradition to poor children in the Kasbah in Tangiers, where they now reside. Indeed, many of the musicians who have become interested and involved in Andalusi music must accommodate themselves to a life that straddles both sides of the Mediterranean. While waiting for the photographer, I spoke with Ahmed about his encounters with some of these pioneering figures of the Andalusian musical scene. "I remember when I first sat and played with Luis Delgado," he began. "He knew the compositions very well. He had great technical skills, but he had no sense of the character of the music. The character was missing from his playing. He was shocked the first time we played, as he saw that he had to learn a new way to play. Ahmed demonstrated on the violin the contrast between Delgado's initial playing style and his own, emphasizing the colorations and textures specific to Andalusi music and their absence from Delgado's style. Ahmed has become a committed advocate of Andalusi music and frequently performs for the Junta Andalusi, one of the main branches of the provincial government entrusted to organizing cultural events. This recuperation of the sort of Andalusian past, right, it begins quite strongly with the Andalusista movement from the early 20th century, in the 10s and 20s. At these performances, he at times will perform pieces that are a mixture of Andalusi music and flamenco, a combination that many musicians in the region have begun to experiment with. As opposed to Javier, Ahmed insisted on the commonalities binding flamenco and Andalusi forms, and Aged showed me on the violin some of the stylistic and tonal overlappings. He is particularly adamant about the need to teach about Andalusi music in schools, and has for a long while been working with other musicians and promoters of Andalusian culture to build a school that would offer instruction in the genre. People often come up to me after a concert and want to know more about the music. Unfortunately, there are no institutions that teach about it. In Morocco, there are conservatories where one can learn all about the music, but here in Andalusia, there are no institutions that support it. It is only through the individual efforts of people who care about it that it survives here. As the oldest and most musically knowledgeable of the group, the others look to Ahmed for direction when needed. For many years now, he has been taking young Spaniards interested in Andalusi music under his wing, helping them to cultivate musical skills and sensibilities, and establishing close friendships with some of them as well. Set right on the edge of the narrow medieval quarter of Albaicin, where many North Africans now make a trade catering to tourists, the tea house he runs with his brother provides a modest income, though from what I could tell, it is frequented far more by friends than by tourists, and is routinely closed in the afternoon for music practice sessions. His livelihood has been enabled by the cultural forms and expertise he has to offer, especially to tourists and national promoters of Andalusian culture. That said, the trajectories he has followed, aesthetic, social, religious, geographical, map out a territory, not simply of an Arab living in Europe, but of an Arabic Europe, one whose historical opening is figured by that idealized image, al-Andaluz. The fascination and romance with al-Andaluz, promoted today by the heritage industry, and I'm concluding here, and through the cultural politics of the Andalusian state, have opened up new possibilities for remapping one's place, as I mentioned, within Europe, and for organizing one's life within a different political and geographical and cultural geography than that promoted by the managers of cultural identity. While the teteria I described bears many of the scars of a highly commodified cultural object, it also provides the resources, the location, and even a cultural style that enables it to serve as a nodal point for the musical practices I've described. Thank you.
Thank you very much.